Hello, welcome to the Music Show on Radio National. Today's show starts in Harlem, where it's 1971. We're listening to the theme from Shaft, even if you didn't see the 1971 Gordon Parks film, you will surely have heard Isaac Hayes' soundtrack. John Shaft is a private detective. He's billed as hotter than Bond, cooler than Bullitt, and the film is part of the so-called blaxploitation genre. It's a portmanteau word, black and exploitation, because the films were some of the first to be directly marketed to black audiences, with black casts, black directors and soundtrack composers. We're talking not only about Shaft, but Superfly and Trick Baby and Sweet Sweetback's Badass song. You have to say it like that because there's two A's in bad and there's half a dozen S's in ass. They're still popular enough, but perhaps the soundtracks are more popular yet. They were scored by the likes of James Brown and Curtis Mayfield, Marvin Gaye and Bobby Womack. The heyday of blaxploitation was the 1970s, and Michael A. Gonzalez was there. Now he's a cultural critic and writer. He writes for Wax Poetics and Ebony and Catapult, lots of other publications, and he's going to be our guide through some of these soundtracks. Later on the show, we're going to talk to Charlie Parr. He's a bluesman, a wonderful guitarist, singer, songwriter from Duluth, Minnesota, and he's got a new album out. It's called Last of the Better Days Ahead. It's just been put out on the Smithsonian Folkways label, so he joins people such as Elizabeth Cotton and Leadbelly. Charlie talks, among other things, about how his songs never stay the same.
They change with your mood, they change with the sound of the venue you're playing in, they change with the audience's reaction. They're very fluid.
Charlie Parr later. First, the music of blaxploitation.
Who's the black private dick that's a sex machine to all the chicks? You're damn right. Man that would risk his neck for his brother, man. Can you dig it? Who's the cat that won't cop out when there's danger all about? Right on. You see, this cat Shaft is a bad mother.
Shut your mouth.
What I'm talking about, Shaft?
Then we can do it.
He's a complicated man, but no one understands him but his woman.
John Shaft.
That's the theme from Shaft, the Isaac Hayes' theme from Shaft, the film soundtrack released 50 years ago last week. And it's probably better known these days than the film itself, I suppose. Michael A. Gonzalez is a cultural critic and writer. He joins me on the Music Show now from Baltimore, Maryland. And Michael, maybe I could ask you to start just by sketching in what blaxploitation cinema was. What are the hallmarks of this film genre?
Well, when blaxploitation started, it wasn't even called blaxploitation. It was really this movement that started in the late 60s, early 70s of, in the beginning, black gangster movies. I mean, Shaft, Sweetback, all of these movies were like black men against the law, or, a sense of lawlessness or anti-heroes that were a big part of the narrative. Shaft was a private detective, and if you read the books, he was actually a Vietnam vet, but he didn't get all that backstory in the movies. But all of these guys were kind of like these anti-heroes. They were, playing against the stereotypes and the types that had been in movies for like the last 50 or so years beforehand. I mean, the 50s and 60s had Sidney Poitier. This was the next level.
I mean, you came of age, really, didn't you, during the heyday of these films? What did they mean to you when you went to see them?
I grew up watching all kinds of movies. And, as a child of the 70s, I saw, at the local cinema, I saw a lot of the black movies, whether it was Superfly or The Mac or Shaft, but also a lot of the so-called New Hollywood movies, whether it was Serpico or the movies of Coppola, or, and all of these movies kind of blended in with each other for me. Growing up, it was nice to see finally these black superheroes. I had grown up watching James Bond. I loved James Bond, but there was never any black characters that were like James Bond. And for the first time with characters like Shaft or like Superfly, even though some of these guys were, walking on the side of lawlessness, they still had these heroic aspects to them. And, so like the movies were entertainment. I mean, I didn't look up to them like, I want to be a pimp when I grow up, but I just kind of liked it in the way that, most people just like gangster movies.
This is The Music Show on Radio National. I'm speaking to Michael A. Gonzalez, and we're talking about the music of blaxploitation movies. It is The Music Show, Michael, so we should talk about the music. So let's go back to Isaac Hayes. He'd been around for a while, hadn't he? But was Shaft his big break?
Well, he had been around as a songwriter and producer at Stax for at least 10 years before he finally broke out. Shaft was his big break in terms of the mainstream, but, he was already putting out records on Stax that were doing well. Hot Buttered Soul came out the same year. Black Moses came out, so he was already doing these kind of things. Shaft was my introduction to Isaac Hayes, though. I think I was 8 years old when Shaft came out. So I didn't even see the movie until years later, but I had to soundtrack the album because that song, this theme from Shaft that everybody knows, like you said, probably is more popular than the movie itself. It was such an imprint. And, it's kind of funny because I never thought about it until years later, but these soundtracks were done really to market the movies. I was talking to Gordon Parks years later, and he was telling me how, when they put the soundtrack out a couple of months before the movie came out. So by the time the movie came out, whether it was Shaft, whether it was Superfly, people already had these images in their mind. And I mean, not only was it great music, but it was also used to, market the films.
Oh, well, that was one leaf they took out of the James Bond book, wasn't it?
Well, I don't know if James Bond themes were released before the movies.
Oh, they were.
Were they? Okay. I wasn't really checking for James Bond themes. I love James Bond themes, but I wasn't buying them. Like, I didn't feel the need to have a James Bond theme until Live and Let Die came out. But, I wasn't buying Tom Jones records. I wasn't buying Shirley Bassey records, but I wanted to have the Isaac Hayes records. I wanted to have the Curtis Mayfield records.
Isaac Hayes, of course, agreed to do the score if he could also audition for the role of Shaft. And that didn't happen, did it? Richard Roundtree is Shaft, no question about it. But I think that's very sweet that he thought he could be Shaft.
Well, it's kind of interesting because Isaac did later on become an actor. Whether or not he was a great actor or not is up to debate, I'm sure. But he did a couple of blaxploitation movies, Three Tough Guys, Truck Turner, and he also did the soundtracks to those movies. He was also in Escape from New York and, for years was on South Park. So he got his acting Jones off. I mean, to me, the one that's even more hilarious was
Get Down!
James Brown. James Brown did a beautiful, great, funky soundtrack to the movie Black Caesar. But he also wanted to audition to be Black Caesar. Now, anybody who's ever heard James Brown talk, I can't imagine him during a whole hour and a half film playing a gangster. I mean, not to say that he wasn't a tough guy. I just can't imagine that voice in Harlem in the 70s. So they got the right person to play Black Caesar.
Look at me! Know what you see? See a bad mother. Paid the cost to be the boss. Paid the cost to be the boss. Look at me. Know what you see? See a bad mother.
There had been black jazz composers doing movie soundtracks before these blaxploitation movies came along. Duke Ellington in Anatomy of a Murder is actually there on screen like Isaac Hayes wanted to be. But we should talk about the sound of Shaft and these other movies because it's incredibly distinctive, isn't it? Funk soul becomes the sound of this entire genre. Why do you think that was, and why did it hold so tightly to the genre?
Well, I mean, music is constantly changing, and I think this was the beginning of the 70s. People were ready for something different. I mean, the 60s had been Motown and tuxedos and all of that stuff, and then with James Brown and then with Sly Stone, music started opening up a little bit. I mean, Sly Stone released his "There's a Riot Going On" the same year that the Shaft soundtracks came out. I mean, there was so much great music that came out in 71. It was almost like these guys were competing with each other to see who could be more soulful, who could be more funky. And I mean, Isaac was just able to do it. The way he even went into the studio. I mean, he was unorthodox in his ways because, he didn't write down music. Isaac couldn't write music. He composed a lot in his head. He would teach his musicians things by like humming them stuff or whatever, but they didn't do things in the traditional way that a Henry Mancini or a John Barry might. So even when it came time for him to be nominated for an Oscar, he almost got dropped because of it, because they were saying, well, if the score wasn't written down, then he wasn't really a real musician or whatever. And basically Henry Mancini and Quincy Jones came to his defense, and that's how he, wound up actually getting the Oscar nomination in the first place.
We should talk about one or two of the sounds themselves. I mean, the bongos, the hi-hat that we heard right at the beginning, and perhaps most famously of all, the wah-wah pedal, which became ubiquitous, didn't it?
Yes. Well, let me tell you, those drums in the beginning, I mean, I've heard more funk and soul drummers who came of age during that period tell me those were the drums that got them into drums. Those were the sounds that pulled them in and made them realize. Because if you listen to how the record is built, it's almost like each instrument kind of comes in by itself and then it all melts in together. All of those guys on those records, I mean, these are country boys that are playing this music. These are all guys from Memphis who grew up under segregation, who grew up in the, making this funky, very urban kind of music. I mean, when you hear Shaft, you don't think of Memphis. You don't think of, Fields and all of this. You're thinking of some guy walking through Times Square or some guy walking through Harlem. I mean, so these guys, they had to put that urban side out there.
Marvin Gaye, whose album What's Going On, I mean, we celebrated its 50th anniversary not so long ago on this program, and his follow-up was the soundtrack to Trouble Man, wasn't it? And he played everything and sang everything.
Yeah, I mean, that's a brilliant album. I love that album. I don't think I appreciated it as much when I was younger because it's such an adult album. It's much more jazz. I mean, with the exception of the lead song, it's not really a soul album in that sense. I mean, it's, to me, my favorite album out of the whole genre is Superfly, like what Curtis Mayfield did, because it was, basic song structure and he's writing these soul songs. I mean, Marvin was doing like a jazz suite of some kind. But when I started listening to it years later, it became I write crime fiction as well. And I also write true crime for a site called Crime Reads. And I use these records as my soundtrack sometimes while I'm working. And I probably have used the Trouble Man album as my writing music more so than any of the other blaxploitation albums.
Let's come back to Curtis Mayfield, because you mentioned him a couple of times, and he's the creator of Superfly, as you said. This was his third solo record, and you hear him reaching notes that he hadn't reached before. I mean, it's really quite expansive singing, and I wonder whether, in a sense, being the provider of a soundtrack gave Curtis Mayfield freedom to explore new musical ground.
Well, he was already kind of exploring those grounds, what people would call, I guess, psychedelic funk or even like black rock or whatever, because he was already, like, when he left the Impressions and started going solo, the music became a little bit less pop, a little bit blacker. I mean, there was some heavy stuff going on. I mean, I think Curtis was very influenced by what was happening in Chicago. You have to realize a lot of these guys were very young when they started. And, by the time Curtis got to do Superfly, he was a grown man. He had seen what drugs did to people. He had seen a lot more and experienced a lot more than he had, when he was in the Impressions. I mean, Curtis was always a heavy writer anyway. So, you get the subject of drug abuse and he just went off. I mean, he just really did his thing. And I think, Curtis said more than once that he felt like the movie celebrated cocaine and he wanted his music to be the opposite. So it was kind of like the movie and the music were having a tug of war. And I don't know if there's a winner. I think there's a draw, because I love Superfly. And I think one of the things too we have to point out is that Superfly was directed by Gordon Parks' son. Gordon Parks directed Shaft and his son directed Superfly.
I'm your mama, I'm your daddy, I'm that nigga in the alley. I'm your doctor when you need, want some coke, have some weed. You know me, I'm your friend, your main boy, thick and thin. I'm your pusher man. I'm your pusher man.
Now that it's also long ago, the 1970s, the music is, as we've said, better known than the movies. Did the movies have a legacy, would you say? What did they make possible? What has happened since that wouldn't have happened without these movies?
I think the movies still have a legacy. I mean, at least in the States, they do. I mean, a lot of young Black filmmakers and young white filmmakers love the Blaxploitation movies. I mean, we know Quentin Tarantino is a huge Blaxploitation fan. I'm sure people like the Hughes brothers and Spike Lee and the late John Singleton, they all grew up on Blaxploitation movies. A lot of the rappers, a lot of writers, a lot of painters. I mean, these things go across the board. I mean, myself as a writer, especially when I'm writing my crime fiction or true crime stories, have been really influenced by Blaxploitation movies about, how they look or, how they sound or whatever. I still go back and look at certain films. I mean, Shaft doesn't interest me in the same way that Across 110th Street does, or that Superfly does, or any other movies that were considered Blaxploitation that might not have necessarily been Blaxploitation, like a Cooley High, which is about, young Black guys in high school, or their last couple months of high school, and, how they're dealing with growing up to be men. There's so many movies from that era that weren't gangster movies. A movie like Claudine, which Gladys Knight and the Pips did the soundtrack for, but all the songs were written by Curtis Mayfield. Another movie called Sparkle, that the soundtrack was done by Aretha Franklin, and a great soundtrack. And, another one that was written by Curtis Mayfield. These songs and these films, I mean, they still have an influence. And like I said, at least in the States, I can't speak about overseas, but I know over here, people are still looking at those movies.
As you talk, I'm thinking we must do a whole Curtis Mayfield show one of these days. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank you, Michael A. Gonzalez, for being my guest on today's music show to talk about these soundtracks from the Blaxploitation movies of the 1970s. Thanks.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much.
Hoppin' John from the film Sweetback's Badass Song. I get to say it again. It's the film and soundtrack, like Shaft, that turned 50 this year. The film was written, co-produced, edited, directed, scored by and starred Melvin Van Peebles, and the soundtrack was performed by the then unknown Earth, Wind and Fire. In that interview with Michael A. Gonzalez, we also heard music from Superfly, Black Caesar and Trouble Man, as well as Shaft. You can find the music details on our website, and you can also find some links there to Michael's writing, including an article in Wax Poetics about Curtis Mayfield and Superfly. And if you stay till the end of today's show, there's another track coming later, a special recommendation from Michael. You're listening to The Music Show on Radio National, and we'll stay in the United States of America, but we're going to change pace and era, and we're going to head to the Midwest Charlie Parr was born and raised in Minnesota. He started playing guitar at the age of 8, and he's been putting out albums of original songs all of this century. His latest, by some counts, his 16th, is called Last of the Better Days Ahead. It's on the Smithsonian Folkways label, and we'll start with the title track.
Money can't buy back that 64 Falcon that you sold in your 20s and regretted it was gone. Cause you thought it contained some meaning or some answers to a life that you never bothered to question or even take a good close look at. And it broke her heart to see how it had been so important, from the feeling of the steering wheel to the rubber on the road. And now it's grown to unrealistic proportions in your mind. Now you're in your 50s, why can't you forget how the chrome bumper shined in the sun? If you could just go back, even for a minute, you could forget how you don't even know what it was you've lost. Why you always feel so empty in spite of all you have? Were those feelings you remember even real? Were they honestly about some junky old Falcon or any other thing that you could own? Now it's all so stale and you feel so very old, like you've taken all your chances and tossed them all aside for some stupid piece of metal like shiny bits of trash that line the stolen nest of a greedy neighborhood crow. So you drive back to your hometown to visit with your past, but nothing looks the same anymore. Except you can see all that you squandered where you were shining all that chrome. You were handed all you needed without cost, but you were too blind to see it, and you took it all for granted, and now you want to complain. Tell me just what it was that you lost. Well, now you start to panic, and your gas is running low, and you need to find some meaning for you're stranded on the road, and the engine finally dies near a soybean field of dust. You just sit and watch the sunset turn the entire sky to rust. Turn the entire sky to rust. Turn the entire sky to rust.
Last of the Better Days Ahead. That's the opening track and the title track of the new album from Charlie Parr. It's a great pleasure to welcome Charlie Parr to the music show. Charlie, tell us about that song, would you? I mean, to what extent is it a song? You say in the liner notes that you think of these songs as poems. On the page, this one looks like a short story. What's the difference between all of these different sorts of writing?
Well, this whole record kind of had a different feeling to me, and maybe prose poem or short story is a better way to look at it. I'm not a poet, so when I started writing these songs, they were coming out more like long form poetry than they were coming out like songs. They didn't have the usual kind of melody associated with them. That when I write songs, I don't usually start with poetic kind of lyrics. I start with the idea of a story and a guitar part in my head, and then I go from there. These songs were all coming out onto the notebook without music attached to them, and so a lot of the songs, and the title track in particular, had, I think, 5 different versions that I had come up with on how to kind of marry the lyrics to music. For most of the record, it kind of went that way.
That's interesting. Did you find that the songs turned out to be about things that you didn't normally write about because you were writing in a different way?
No, not really. I mean, this is, this batch of songs is kind of right in the wheelhouse of what I normally write about and want to write about. It was just the process was really different. And admittedly, this whole record was written in about the 3 to 4 months, following the middle of March and our lockdown here, which I don't know if that had anything to do with it or not. I was actually playing more guitar than I would normally be playing when I'd be touring, because I was just waiting. And so I was playing guitar, but still the lyrics, came out in this other kind of way.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, you began as a guitarist, so maybe you're going to end up as a novelist.
Well, careful for what you wish for.
There's some wonderful storytelling on this album. Just to go as far as track 2, Blues for Whitefish Lake, that's a lovely idea for a story, and particularly the sort of note of doubt in the song about to what extent it's a real memory and to what extent it's imagined. Could you tell us something about this one?
It was 1975. My dad and I were fishing on this lake. It's Whitefish Lake. It's in northern Minnesota. We're not catching anything. And, I was, 9? I was bored. Dad suggested that we call it a day. And we motored across the lake in the opposite direction from where our camp was. And he knew exactly where he was going. We stopped at this little dock where he tied the boat up, walked up a long flight of these like kind of rickety wooden steps. And at the top of the staircase, there was this little bar. And we went inside. The guy that ran the place knew my dad. Like, everybody seemed to know my dad when I was a kid. He had a beer and I had a grape soda, and we played pool all afternoon. And it was one of my very favorite memories of my life, because I kind of had him all to myself, and I got to hear his stories, and I got to kind of spend time with him, where it was just, we weren't doing anything. We were just bumming, and it's a memory I'll treasure. The song isn't really about that. The song it feels darker than that to me, but the basic story is, I guess, true.
Heading across the lake in my little boat, a surface of glass. I am bound for a notch in the trees, riding wooden steps. It's difficult to see in the waning light, Northland's October evening. Concentrate on the pool of water that travels from bow to stern.
On today's music show, I'm speaking to Charlie Parr. He's at his home in Duluth, Minnesota. Charlie, there's a strong sense that these songs come very much from life. From your life experiences, and sometimes it can be a very small moment, and I particularly like the inspiration for listening to Robert Johnson. On the face of it, it looks like this is a historical reference. Here you are, a blues musician and a guitarist. What's more, why wouldn't you be writing about Robert Johnson? But actually, the song is about something else which any of us could experience.
Yeah, hearing familiar things out of context for me has always been really interesting. And Robert Johnson's a good example of this, because when, I had those records when I was a kid. When I was a teenager, they had up at the library the 2 volumes of the Robert Johnson records. When they released the CD set, the complete collection, I had come to think of Robert Johnson as kind of a private thing that I had, because not many people in my town knew or listened to Robert Johnson. So when the complete collection came out and you started to hear it in places, that it felt so different hearing it out of its context of my room, in my stereo, And I was the kind of person I would stop in my tracks and just listen, because the music sounded different all of a sudden because it wasn't being played at home. And I love that. I love that feeling.
And I heard music down the avenue that punctured right through the traffic sound, harsh and sweet all at the same time. I hurried to follow it down. I stopped outside a gray house near an alley and found my way to the sound.
But you also have to go home then, don't you? And put it back in its regular context. And do you hear it differently?
Yeah, I kind of do. I kind of do hear it differently. I mean, it's a really good point. I mean, it's a really fine point. It's difficult to describe what it's like to hear music in one place and then hear it someplace else. You know, there's a whole set of music that I listen to very specifically when I'm driving, and I don't listen to it much when I'm at home. And then there's another set of musical styles that I listen to at home and I don't often listen to when I'm driving. And sometimes the two get mixed up, and it's a really unique experience because it might be something I listen to a lot, but suddenly the context is different and I hear it differently. Maybe what you're looking at changes how you hear things. I don't really know, but playing guitar is the same way too. I can play guitar all day long in my room. If I take my guitar outside and play it on the sidewalk, it's a different experience. Maybe it's like that.
Your own guitar style, of course, is not strictly related to Robert Johnson. It's a Piedmont blues style. Could you tell us something about your approach to the guitar and what lies behind it, who lies behind it?
I don't know that I have an approach to the guitar. When I was 8 when I got a guitar, but there wasn't lessons. You know, I just sat and listened to records and tried to figure out what was going on. You know, the guitarists that I listened to when I was a kid were, you know, I was really fascinated with solo guitar music. Mance Lipscomb, Lightning Hopkins, so, you know, early Bob Dylan records. The sound of just one person playing a guitar and singing songs, you know, just completely obsessed me. And so I was trying to take after that. The first time I really felt like I started to get it was playing along with Mance Lipscomb records. And Mance was a Texas guitar player, but he did play with more of a Piedmont kind of alternating thumb, bass part, melody, finger part. And I gravitated towards that. And for the longest time, I would translate everything into that style. You know, it's not studied and it's certainly not precise. I wouldn't, you know, dare to try to teach anybody anything because I don't feel like I really know what I'm doing. It's a guessing game a lot of the times, but I still learn pieces that way, and I still play more by the gut than by the book.
A lot of the music that you listened to growing up would have been on the Smithsonian Folkways label, and you're there now. This album is your debut on that label, so this is significant. I mean, how does it feel to be joining the likes of Lead Belly and Woody Guthrie?
It's amazing. You know, it's not something I would have ever guessed, because the library in the town I grew up in had a lot of Folkways records, and I checked them out a lot. My collection of records at home has a significant portion of it is Folkways records. It's not something that I thought was going to happen, and you know, I was going to be able to join this label. And it's a massive honor. Beyond that, I mean, I don't even know if I can put words on it. I'm very, very grateful to join that group. And they've been incredibly supportive and kind to me. So I'm nothing but gratitude from me.
Do you think it accounts for your change of approach to writing?
I don't. I think this record was going to be different no matter what. And, I started writing this record, 3 months before I got the confirmation that Smithsonian would like to work with me. When we started to record it, initially I had some ideas that I needed to do something very, very special and different. And then I didn't do that. And a lot of that was because of Smithsonian's, their kindness and just saying, no, we want you to do what you do and we're going to put that out. And so when it came down to it, I made the record that I felt the songs called for.
Do you find that your songs change as you perform them? I mean, when you're able finally to tour properly again, will the songs on this album begin to, be modified? Will they grow? Will they develop?
Yes, absolutely. They have already started doing that. I've had the opportunity to do some shows already, and this has been true though for me for my entire life or career of songwriting. I don't think that songs are ever finished. They never feel finished. It's like you get to write them all over again when you sit down and perform. You haven't painted a picture or written a book. It's not static. It's very fluid, and they do change, and they change with your mood. They change with the sound of the venue you're playing in. They change with the audience's reaction. They're very fluid, and I really like that about songs. I like that feeling of getting to kind of recreate something all over again, and you never get tired of it. It's never done. It's always a work in progress, and you've not hurt anything or done anything in particular. I mean, you've moved air molecules around, and then they move back to where they were later on, and nobody's the wiser. So it's kind of the perfect crime in a lot of ways.
Can we talk finally about Decoration Day, which is the final track on the album and by far the longest? It's a sort of soundscape, really, in which you're joined by other musicians as well. And musically, it seems to me to be, well, there's two other pieces of music I know of called Decoration Day. There's the Charles Ives orchestral piece, and there's a Sonny Boy Williamson song, and this piece of yours seems to be about halfway between the two.
I love those two pieces of music, by the way. And Decoration Day was the name of Memorial Day here some years ago, and it was a special day for me because my dad would take us for a car ride on Decoration Day down to where his family was buried, and we got to hear all the stories all the way down there and got to eat lunch in a little diner. And it was a special day for me. But yeah, I listened to a lot of instrumental music. I listened to a lot of experimental music. I've always wanted to create the kinds of soundscapes that, especially instrumental guitar players, like John Fahey or Robbie Basho or Leo Kottke or Jack Rose, some of those folks created. That's always been something that I've been interested in and try to do occasionally. I think Decoration Day is probably the most fully formed version of the thing that I've wanted to do.
Perhaps you could say something about how you would translate the notion of Decoration Day and of your memories of it into music. Are you able to put it into words?
The way that I approached this particular piece of music was by kind of creating a landscape in my mind, which the part of where I'm talking about is, northwest Iowa into southwest Minnesota. It's a prairie you can see for a long, long ways. And it's pretty much unbroken agricultural land, fields and prairies and occasional trees. And I tried to get that kind of stuck in my mind. as I started to like put the piece together, it's a really fluid piece. I mean, it's based really, really loosely on a couple of phrases that I created. They don't necessarily have to go together in any order, but as I play it, you know, I can kind of feel that landscape coming out of it, you know, long and flat. The song kind of goes dark for me because I'm imagining it's the end of the day. My dad is driving us back from these areas and talking, and you know, as the sun starts to get low, it's kind of that, you know, that gloaming time of the day, you know, and everybody gets quiet and the sun starts to go away and suddenly it's gone. And the last like 7 minutes of the song, you can't see the landscape anymore. The kind of the sunny part of the song, the 12 string, goes away and sets and is replaced by something else a little darker.
Charlie Parr, it's been really a great pleasure to talk to you on The Music Show. Thank you very much for being my guest, and congratulations on the album.
Well, likewise. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. I really appreciate it.
That's Charlie Parr's Decoration Day, and it's the final track, a long 15-minute track that closes Last of the Better Days Ahead. It's on the Smithsonian Folkways label. That's it for today's music show. Tomorrow we're going to ask how we can present and listen to music that was composed during the period of the Third Reich, or even just performed during that period and recorded. It's a topic that we've talked about before on the music show, and we'll hear from some of the voices in our archive. We'll hear Alex Ross on Wagner, for example, the singers Maria Larigi and Tabitha McFadgen on the opportunist soprano Elisabeth Schwarzkopf, and also academic Joy Calico talking about Schoenberg's piece, A Survivor from Warsaw, the 7-minute work which she says was calculated to irritate every exposed nerve of the post-war period. We'll leave the last word on today's show, though, to Michael A. Gonzalez, who will tell us about a lesser-known blaxploitation soundtrack that we ought to check out.
Another artist who also did a blaxploitation soundtrack that's not very well known is Barry White. Barry White did a soundtrack album called Together Brothers. And it's actually it's a very cheaply made movie, but it's a good movie. I really like it. And I love Barry's soundtrack. And to me, that's one of the underrated soundtracks ever. I mean, Barry even talked badly about the movie. I interviewed him in '94, and he didn't like the movie at all, but the soundtrack is incredible.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Somebody is gonna alter man. Everybody, I just don't understand. In the name of justice, in the name of peace, but will this killing and fighting ever cease? People ripping off their fellow man, doing everything wrong, everything they can. Why they want off the man? I just don't understand. People, can't you see what we're living in? The way the world is now, ain't nobody win. Oh, they want off the man. I just don't understand. No. Gonna get back. That was Lord, yeah.